Alright, in our final video for lecture 3, we're going to talk about shortcut ways we can modify our variables. Now the first way is incrementing and decrementing a variable's value by 1. And the shorthand way of doing it is to put plus plus at the end of your variable or minus minus at the end of your variable. This is a shorter way of saying add 1 to your variable and assign it back to your variable. And variable minus minus is a shorthand way of saying subtract 1 to your variable value and assign it back to your variable. So let's look what's happening here. So these are in succession. So let's say A starts out at 3. According to this statement, it says increment A by 1 and assign it back to A. That's what's happening. So at the end of these two lines, A is going to be 4. In this one, we have B, which is a double, and in the next line we say B plus plus. That just basically means increment B by 1 and assign it back to B. So at the end of these two statements, B is 2.5. I can also decrement by doing minus minus. So A starts out at 3, and then A minus minus means decrease by 1 and assign it back to A. Or if my double starts out as 1.5 and I do B minus minus, it means decrement by 1, so I would get 0.5. So these are just shorthand ways of doing it, and when we get to for loops, you'll do these quite frequently. Now we also have other shorthand ways to modify a variable's value. If I wanted to add a value other than 1, or I could still do this with 1, but if I wanted to add any value to my variable and assign it back, or subtract or divide or multiply or find the remainder, I can do these shorthand ways of doing it. So what's happening here is A starts out as 11. This is saying A gets A plus 4. So basically you add 4 and you assign it back to A. Or what's happening in this line, this is equivalent to saying B equals B minus 4. I subtract 4 from B and I assign it back to B. Or what's happening here is I start off with my C value and I multiply it by 4 and I assign it back to C. Or in this one, I divide D by 11 by 4, and because these are integers, I only get an integer value, and I assign it back to D. And then what's happening here is I find the remainder when dividing by 4. So remember, 11 divided by 4 is going to have a remainder of 3. So I find the remainder when dividing by 4 and assign it back to E. So these are just shorthand ways of modifying and assigning new values to your variables. Now, chances are you're going to have to get used to code tracing, and one recommendation I have is to list your variables and their initial values. So X starts as 0, Y starts as 5, and Z starts as 1. And as you go line by line, modify and update your variables. So here when I do X plus plus, that means increment X by 1. And then here when I say Y minus equals 3, that means subtract your Y value by 3. And in this line, I take my X value, which is currently 1, and my Z value, which is currently 1, and I add them together, and I assign that to Z. And in this line, I take my current Y value, which is 2, my current Z value, which is 2, and I multiply them together, and I assign that to X. And in this line, I take my Y value, and I find the remainder when dividing by 2. So let's see, 2 divided by 2 has a remainder of 0. And so after finding the remainder when I divide by 2, I assign that back to Y. And then this Z minus minus means take your Z value and subtract 1. And so when all of these lines are done, you'll notice that X is 4, Y is 0, and Z is 1. But this is not something you do in your brain. It is something you write down and you trace line by line. As you go through each line, you update your variables, and you always use the current value when substituting into the right-hand side of your expression before evaluating and then assigning it back to the indicated variable.